When I write, I think in terms of music, and there's music on all the time that I'm working. They surprised me for my birthday. He brought the whole band out to Hollywood, set them up on a stage at Paramount, and we've been friends a long time.
For decades, he was the funniest man on American television, a performer so committed to physical comedy that he treated his own body like a stunt prop, throwing himself into walls, off ladders, and across furniture for a laugh. Audiences adored him. Paramount Pictures paid him more money than almost anyone else in Hollywood. But away from the cameras, the people who stood closest to him told a very different story, one of fear, cruelty, and a hunger for control that never seemed to end. This is the story of Jerry Lewis, and of the wide, uncomfortable gap between the man on stage and the man at home. Joseph Levitch was born on March 16, 1926, in Newark, New Jersey, to a family already steeped in show business. His father worked the vaudeville circuit as a singer and MC, and his mother played piano for local radio broadcasts. Because both parents were almost constantly on the road, young Joey spent much of his early childhood being shuffled between relatives and hotel rooms, rarely settled anywhere for long. That instability shaped him in ways he spent the rest of his life trying to outrun. He first stepped on a stage at the age of 5, singing at a Catskills resort where his parents were performing, and he later said that the applause solved something in him that nothing else could. It told him he was wanted. It told him he existed. That need for the spotlight would go on to define both his greatest triumphs and his ugliest moments. His teenage years brought a failed solo act built around mouthing along to records which went nowhere. Everything changed in 1946 when he crossed paths with a smooth, easygoing singer named Dean Martin at a nightclub. Lewis is on record saying that he pursued the partnership aggressively, practically pleading for the chance to team up. In July of that year, the two made their pairing official at the 500 Club in Atlantic City, and the chemistry was immediate. Martin crooned and stayed cool, while Lewis turned into an explosion of noise and motion, climbing over tables, dropping trays, throwing his body around like a man at war with gravity. Crowds could not get enough of it. Within a few years, Martin and Lewis were arguably the biggest live act in the country, headlining a hit NBC variety show and churning out a string of profitable Paramount comedies, including My Friend Irma, The Caddy, and Artists and Models. By his mid-20s, Lewis was already one of the most powerful young men in American entertainment. It could not last. As the act grew, so did Lewis's appetite for creative control, and so did his anxiety about Martin's independent popularity. Martin, for his part, grew tired of being treated as the straight man in an act that was increasingly built around Lewis's antics. According to accounts from people close to the pair, tensions boiled over during production of The Delicate Delinquent when Martin balked at being cast as a police officer and Lewis refused to budge. Martin walked. The team officially dissolved in the summer of 1956, ending a 10-year run that had made both men wealthy beyond anything either could have imagined. What followed was almost as famous as the partnership itself, nearly 2 decades of total silence between the two men, broken only when Frank Sinatra orchestrated a surprise on-air reunion during a 1976 telethon. Even that moment, warm as it looked on camera, never fully repaired what had been lost. What makes the story of that breakup unusually credible is that Lewis himself eventually admitted his part in it. In his 2005 memoir, Dean and Me, A Love Story, he wrote candidly about the person he became once fame and money arrived all at once, describing how the unraveling of the partnership turned him into someone who bullied people on set and took his frustration out on crew members because he could no longer direct it at Martin. That is a striking confession for any performer to put in print, and it means the harsher stories that later attached themselves to his name did not come only from rivals or gossip. They were, in part, confirmed by the man himself. After the split, Lewis reinvented himself as something rare in Hollywood, a true multi-hyphenate who wrote, directed, produced, and starred in his own pictures. Working first with director Frank Tashlin, and then increasingly on his own, he built a run of hits that included The Bellboy, The Ladies' Man, The Errand Boy, Cinderfella, and in 1963, The Nutty Professor, a film many critics still consider his finest achievement. Because his movies kept making money, Paramount granted him near total creative freedom, a level of authority that critic Leonard Maltin once described as complete autonomy over his own pictures. For a stretch in the early 1960s, he was reportedly the highest-paid star in Hollywood. He was also a genuine technical innovator, Frustrated by having to wait days to see how a scene had turned out, he helped popularize what became known as video assist, rigging a video camera alongside the film camera so he could review a take immediately on a monitor. The technique became standard across the industry. He later wrote a serious textbook on directing, The Total Filmmaker, based on lectures he gave at the University of Southern California, where his students reportedly included a young George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. That same absolute authority on set, though, is where the far less flattering accounts begin. With almost no one able to challenge him, Lewis's temperament on his own productions went largely unchecked. Actor Elliot Gould offered one of the bluntest public assessments of the contradiction between Lewis's image and his private conduct, saying that while Lewis presented himself on television as a caring humanitarian, in Gould's experience, he was one of the most hostile and unpleasant people Gould had ever encountered. That description echoes through obituaries and profiles written over the decades, which regularly used words like gruff, prickly, and quick-tempered to describe him, and noted that he reacted badly to criticism and often dismissed the work of female comedians outright. Lewis repeatedly stated in public forums, including film festival panels, that women simply weren't funny, a claim that provoked walkouts and public backlash, and that he never meaningfully retracted even late in life. For a man who built an entire public persona around warmth and generosity, that blind spot stood out as a genuine and lasting contradiction. The accusations grew far more serious than bruised egos when they reached his own family. In 2017, shortly after Lewis's death, his son Anthony, one of 6 sons from his 38-year marriage to first wife Patty Palmer, spoke publicly about growing up in the Lewis household. He described a home where wealth and status covered up a deep undercurrent of fear, where the children would scatter the moment his father's car pulled into the driveway because none of them knew what mood he'd be in. Anthony alleged he was struck with a belt on at least 2 occasions, though he said the emotional toll of daily life in that house was worse than any physical punishment, summing up his father's conduct toward the family in a single blunt phrase: it was vicious. He was not the only sibling to speak with that kind of bitterness. When Lewis's youngest son, Joseph, died of a drug overdose in 2009 at the age of 45, his older brother Gary, himself a successful 1960s pop star with the #1 hit This Diamond Ring, publicly said their father had turned his back on Joseph and suggested his brother had died partly of heartbreak. These were not children looking to cash in on a famous name. Several had built entirely independent, successful careers and still described their father in strikingly damaged terms. If those family accounts needed any further corroboration, it arrived in an unusually cold and literal form: Jerry Lewis's own will. Signed in 2012 and made public after his death in August 2017, the document did not merely omit his 6 sons from Palmer's marriage. It named every one of them individually, stating plainly that he had intentionally excluded them, listing each by name including the son who had already died, and specifying that neither they nor their own children would receive anything from his roughly $50 million estate. Everything went instead to his second wife, Sandy Pinnick, a Las Vegas dancer he married in 1983, and to their adopted daughter, Danielle. There's also a quieter, sadder coda to the story. Lewis fathered another daughter, Susan, during an affair and never publicly acknowledged her despite DNA testing, and a strong family resemblance reportedly confirming paternity. After his death, journalists located her living without stable housing in Philadelphia. She received nothing from an estate built in part on decades of public fundraising for children in need, and said simply that she believed she deserved something, given her circumstances. Years later, a different set of allegations surfaced from an earlier chapter of his career. In February 2022, Vanity Fair published an investigation, paired with a short documentary from filmmakers Amy Ziering and Kirby Dick, the team behind the campus assault documentary, The Hunting Ground, and the Woody Allen docuseries Allen vs. Farrow, in which several actresses who had worked with Lewis in the 1960s came forward with detailed allegations of sexual harassment and assault. Actress Karen Sharp, who played Lewis's love interest in 1964's The Disorderly Orderly, alleged that during a costume-fitting Lewis cleared the room and then groped her and exposed himself. She said she refused him and offered to leave the production, but was bound by contract. She further alleged that once filming resumed, Lewis froze her out entirely off camera, reportedly instructing the crew not to speak with her and refusing to rehearse, interacting with her only when the cameras were rolling. Actress Hope Holiday made a separate allegation involving a 1961 encounter in Lewis's locked dressing room during production of The Ladies' Man. Because Lewis had died in 2017, none of these claims were ever tested in court, and no formal legal finding was ever made, a distinction worth stating clearly. But they were not anonymous rumors, either. They were specific on-the-record accounts from named actresses with real careers to protect, published by a major outlet, and they lined up uncomfortably well with the documented reality of a performer who held nearly unchecked power over every set he worked on. Sharp and Holliday were not the only women named in that Vanity Fair investigation. The piece also included accounts from actress Renee Taylor, from Jill St. John, who co-starred with Lewis in Who's Minding the Store, and from singer Anna Maria Alberghetti, who worked with him on Cinderfella. Taken together, the women described a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Young actresses cast opposite one of the most powerful men at Paramount, placed in situations he controlled completely, and then, in several accounts, subjected to a kind of quiet professional punishment if they pushed back. Holliday later said she considered reporting the incident to the Screen Actors Guild at the time, but stayed silent because Lewis's standing at the studio felt too powerful to challenge. That fear of retaliation, described independently by more than one woman, is itself one of the more damning threads running through the Vanity Fair report. It is worth pausing on how large Lewis's leverage over these women's careers actually was. By 1959, following the breakup with Martin, he had signed a 7-year deal with Paramount reportedly worth $10 million, a record-setting contract at the time, and a sign of just how much the studio was willing to bet on him alone. A performer with that kind of contract effectively controlled who worked, who got cast again, and who got quietly frozen out. Sharp's account of being iced out on set, crew members reportedly warned not to speak to her, no rehearsals held except when cameras rolled, reads less like a personal grudge and more like the deliberate use of institutional power against someone who had said no to him. Lewis's temper was not confined to closed sets, either. During the 42nd annual MDA telethon in 2007, then 81 years old, he used an anti-gay slur on live television while ad-libbing with his production crew. He apologized the next day, calling it a poor choice of words made in a joking exchange with a colleague, and said the incident did not reflect any personal prejudice on his part. GLAAD publicly condemned the remark regardless, saying it fed into a broader climate of intolerance. The episode became one more example of the gap between the beloved, tearful telethon host America thought it knew and the unfiltered, often careless person operating just off to the side of that image. His professional fortunes were not immune to consequences either. After a remarkable run through the 1960s, Lewis's career slowed considerably following the failure of The Day the Clown Cried and string of poorly received projects. His 1970 film, which Way to the Front, ended up being his last theatrical release for over a decade. A 1976 attempt at a Broadway comeback in a revival of Hellzapoppin' closed amid harsh reviews. Financial mismanagement compounded the professional slide, and in 1981 Lewis was forced to file for bankruptcy despite having earned enormous sums throughout his career. Health problems piled on top of the setbacks, a heart attack in 1965, a back injury the same year that led to a painkiller dependency he battled for years afterward, a second and more serious heart attack in 1982, and a prostate cancer diagnosis in the early 1990s. Through much of this, France remained one of the few places that treated him as a serious artist rather than a punchline. French critics and filmmakers praised the visual intelligence of his directing, embracing him as an auteur years before many American critics were willing to reconsider his work, a contrast that became something of a running joke in the United States even as it reflected a genuine and different critical judgment abroad. No honest account of Jerry Lewis can leave out the Muscular Dystrophy Association telethon, which sits at the very center of both his reputation and its complications. From 1966 to 2010, Lewis hosted the annual Labor Day telethon, a broadcast marathon that often ran more than 20 hours and always closed with him exhausted and in tears, singing, "You'll Never Walk Alone." Over the decades, the event reportedly raised more than $2 billion for muscular dystrophy research, treatment, and summer camps, and in 1977 Lewis was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of the effort. That legacy is real and enormous. But the telethon also drew sustained criticism from disability rights advocates, including former Jerry's Kids poster children, who argued for years that the broadcast built its success on pity, portraying disabled children as helpless objects of sympathy rather than as whole people with dignity and agency. Lewis rarely responded to that criticism with anything other than defensiveness, and at times made remarks about disabled people that many considered demeaning. Then, in 2011, after roughly 6 decades of involvement, his relationship with the MDA ended abruptly and without any clear public explanation from either side. Even his greatest act of generosity closed on a note of unresolved tension. He kept working into his final years and gave one of his most memorable dramatic performances late in life, playing a bitter, guarded talk show host stalked by an obsessive fan in Martin Scorsese's 1983 film, The King of Comedy, a role that many critics noted seemed to draw uncomfortably close to Lewis's own reputation for isolation and control. His strangest project remains the notorious unreleased 1972 film, The Day the Clown Cried, in which Lewis directed and starred as a circus performer who leads Jewish children into a Nazi gas chamber. Legal disputes buried the film for decades, and the small number of people who have seen fragments of it have described its tone as a serious miscalculation. Lewis himself apparently came to view it with discomfort, locking it away and rarely discussing it. He eventually donated a copy to the Library of Congress under the condition it not be screened until 2024. The disinheritance itself became a small legal case study in how deliberately a person can close a door. Because Lewis chose to use a will rather than a private trust, the document automatically became public record once it entered probate, meaning anyone could eventually read the exact language he used to shut his sons out. Estate lawyers who later wrote about the case pointed out that the single word, intentionally, was doing very specific legal work. It left no room for a future court to argue that Lewis had simply forgotten to update an old document or that the omission was an oversight. By naming each son individually, including Joseph, who had already died years earlier, and by explicitly extending the exclusion to their children as well, Lewis made sure that no branch of that side of the family would ever have a claim, now or in a future generation. Whatever his private reasons, he wanted them recorded with total clarity, and he wanted the world, not just his family, to eventually see them. Jerry Lewis died at home in Las Vegas on August 20th, 2017, at the age of 91, reportedly of natural causes related to heart failure, surrounded by his second family. Most of the obituaries that followed led with the laughter and the telethon, exactly as he might have wanted. But underneath that familiar tribute sat a far more complicated man, brilliant, groundbreaking, and generous in ways that changed an entire industry, and at the same time controlling, quick to cruelty, and according to those closest to him, capable of the kind of ordinary, human damage that fame rarely gets asked to answer for. The clown who made a nation laugh for 7 decades left behind children who described him as vicious, colleagues who called him one of the most difficult men they'd ever met, and a will that made his final wishes toward his own family unmistakably, deliberately clear.